I'm Chelsea, and welcome to This is Hard to Say. I'm here to talk about topics that are hard to say, which was originally birthed in 2020 from my lifelong eating disorder. I would love to educate people on disordered eating and also create a platform for us to talk about hard things like trauma, childhood, even simple interactions in our day-to-day life, joy, art. So this really is for all humans. And with that, we'll get going. Hello, my name is Chelsea, and I recently launched a project called This is Hard to Say. In 2020, I started this project, and it took me almost 3 full years to actually launch it. It's April of 2023 now, and 2 months ago during Eating Disorder Awareness Week, I finally launched this project. So on this wild ride we call life, I've found that most experiences I encounter are hard to say. And so I'd love you to join me as I navigate the vulnerabilities of what it means to share these experiences and hardship and also joy, because this has been my alchemy, turning this into a project where I share with the world my stories, the things I encounter, and alchemize them. So in May of 2020, I found myself on my deathbed with an eating disorder. And at the time, I didn't actually know, or maybe I knew on some level, but I didn't know deep in my soul that it was an eating disorder. I came down with a fever, and it was also shortly after COVID. And so at the time, I didn't know whether, wow, maybe I have COVID and I don't know what this is like. I mean, at the time, none of us knew what it was. But on day 4 of fighting this terrible fever, I had hit a point where I couldn't move a muscle in my body. So I called a friend. It was a Tuesday morning, early in the morning, probably 7 a.m. And I had my friend take me to the ER. The second I walked into the ER, they immediately hooked me up. I was pretty delirious at the time. I had been fighting a fever for 4 days at that point, unable to really eat or even keep, fluids up. And they hooked me up, immediately hooking my heart up, putting IV drips in me. And I just remember thinking, wow, my body's shutting down. And I looked at the nurse and I said, what's happening? And she said, well, your heart's struggling and your kidneys are starting to fail you. We have to do everything we can to get you stable, and then we'll go from there. So at that point, they were just trying to figure out, okay, what's wrong with this girl? Like, she came in, she's depleted of everything. I mean, at that point, they did a quick blood draw. They found I was depleted in potassium, iron, albumin, calcium. And if you don't already know about the potassium levels in our body, they pretty much run your heart and make everything work properly. So it's really important to have those balances. So at that point, that's why my heart was having such a hard time. About 5 or 6 hours into this experience, I'm still in the ER part of the hospital here in Santa Barbara, California. And they had, my joints had even swollen to such a degree where I couldn't even bend my knee. And so they had pulled fluid out of my knee to find, okay, well, maybe she's got like a joint infection, but that wasn't it. And I had just been prodded and poked, and 6 hours in, I still had a high fever. So they admitted me, and basically over the course of this week in the hospital, they did every test they possibly could, from putting a tube down my throat to test my stomach lining to see if, okay, maybe she's not able to take food in and absorb nutrients, to just every test under the book. And then they also had given me so many IV drips. I had an iron drip, a potassium drip, a calcium drip, and then on top of it, trying to eat food with a fever. It was quite a week. And I remember it was day 3 or 4, my brother is a nurse up in Santa Cruz, and he had been in contact with the doctors at the hospital. And he was also, calling me as much as he could to figure out, what's going on with her as well. And when he got my lab results, his first thing to me was, Chelsea, you're malnourished. Do you know what that means? And it was the first time anyone had ever confronted me with that thought. I knew something was wrong, obviously, and I knew it wasn't just an illness or a virus. They knew that at the same time. But I still was just in the denial, because when you're malnourished, your brain doesn't work properly. You can't think straight. You're so used to the way things are that you can't really step out of, your reality. So I sat with that and I thought, wow, he's probably not wrong. I mean, I didn't really eat. And when we added the stressors of the start of COVID, and I had my own personal stressors where I was living and what was going on with work, and I had just had a bunch of clients drop me as a graphic designer, and that was really out of their own fear and projection, looking into, okay, we're entering into a pandemic, we're not going to spend money. And so I was under my own level of stress, and that created more of a dip in my own health. I had gotten to a point where I was, jogging every day, this massive trail, and then maybe having like a couple pieces of salami and like a coffee. It was bad. With my brother confronting me with that, I started to really think, okay, you need to be honest with yourself. What is actually going on here? I immediately knew, like, he's onto something. So when the doctor came in, well, they have, intern doctors, or doctors that are basically getting their residency. And he had come in, and he was you could tell he was very like by the book, like every test, science only. This is what we're doing. And if you're familiar at all with the DSM, or like how Western allopathic medicine looks at eating disorders, they kind of only have two camps. It's anorexia nervosa or bulimia. And it's like they're either like, okay, well, you either look anorexic, you look like you're skin and bones, or we heard and know that you're binging and then getting rid of it later and purging. And there's not really the gray area, but in eating disorders or disordered eating, I think disordered eating makes a little bit more sense, because people can be really in a gray area with it. But there's such a range. There's such a spectrum. It could be something really basic as, I'm gonna eat healthy all week long and then binge on the weekend and give myself the ability to eat whatever I want on the weekend. Like, that is a little disordered to think like that. When the doctor came back in to the hospital, I'm still in a position where my potassium also controls your nerves, and not controls your nerves, that's a bad way to put it, but they play a part in how your nerves work in your body. And so I was just in a lot of pain. Like, all of my nerve endings in my whole body were just zinging, and it was painful to move. So I was still kind of like totally laid up. He came in, and I asked him, I said, I think this is a bigger problem than a virus or some unseen thing that you think you're gonna find. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, my brother brought up that I'm malnourished. And he grabbed his face around his cheeks and he said, well, you don't look sunken in enough to me to have a problem. In that moment, I knew that I just needed to finish my time in the hospital and find outside means to get help. Fast forward, I get out of the hospital, and I have a really good friend that took me in and had me stay at their house and helped me recover in an amazing way. But it really, I think I was there for maybe like a month and a half to 2 months. And the place I was living was kind of remote up the mountain. And I knew that I needed to be in town, not so remote, around people. And at the time, they had sent me to the rehab hospital 3 times a week. I was in the pool and just doing basic rehab stuff because I had actually lost a lot in that whole hospitalization, and my body had deteriorated to a point where I just wasn't functioning as well as I could have been. My joints weren't working properly. My nervous system was still not back in working order, and so they had sent me to the rehab hospital 3 times a week to get, I would say it was more than physical rehab. They did a lot mentally for me as well, but the point was is that I knew I needed to be closer. So I found a place, and the transition into living alone was pretty hard. Going from staying at a house where people were, helping me eat meals and teaching me what it's like to think about your future self. Like, hey, I'm gonna be gone for 4 hours, so I'm gonna take a snack, or I'm gonna eat a little bit more because I have a little bit more energy to use. I had never really thought like that. I had been in this scarcity mindset because disordered eating, scarcity comes along with it. And the mindset of, I need to buy all the food, but I'm never gonna touch it. And I'm gonna get into more of that in later episodes, but I moved into this house, and that was a pretty tough transition. I was struggling. I was still, I felt a lot of confusion, brain fog, emptiness, depression, anxiety. Those are pretty heightened when you're not eating. And then it just skyrockets the less nutrients you have in your body and the more depleted you become. And so I was still in that space of just not really functioning properly. My dog was getting old. I knew he was passing away soon. I was trying to spend time with my dog and how do I get better? And I didn't really know where to turn. And I knew that the recovery hospitals for eating disorders, a majority of them are still pretty restrictive and controlling. And if you know anything about eating disorders, you want to avoid restriction and avoid control. You want to move into more of a abundance, freedom, wealth, health, in your mind, in your body. And so I felt kind of turned off by that direction. And one morning I was just feeling terrible. I took my dog to the beach, and I ran into a girlfriend, and she was like, hey, can I walk with you? And I was like, yeah, I'm kind of struggling, but definitely let's go on a walk. And she was like, well, what's going on? What's actually going on? And so I tell her, I was like, yeah, I just got out of the hospital not even 2 months ago, and I just feel terrible still, and I don't really know how to find help. And she immediately was like, one of my best friends is an eating disorder recovery coach. She'll change your life. And I was like, well, that's kind of scary. That sounds like it costs a lot of money. And I was still in very scarce thinking. I don't have enough food. I don't have enough help. I don't have enough this or enough that. And she was like, I'm telling you, I'm just gonna give her your contact. I'm not even gonna give you her contact. I'm just gonna give her yours, and I'm gonna tell her to call you. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. And so 2 days passed maybe, and Chloe, my coach, called me and talked to me for probably an hour, hearing my story. And she was like, yeah, you definitely need help. She had been on the same path, hospitalized as well. And so I started working with Chloe, and I worked with Chloe for 4 months, intensely. Those 4 months were intense. And my dog passed away during that time as well, which really, one thing I've learned about recovery and having a long history of an eating disorder is that emotions will fully trigger it, because when you're empty, you don't have to feel. You don't have to address that stuff, and which is kind of how I was living in my eating disorder. I didn't have to address my emotions. I didn't have to feel stuff. I was like, oh, if I feel full, if I put food in my body, then I feel. So that was a big test of my recovery, to have my dog pass away and still wake up in the morning and eat breakfast, because breakfast was the hardest. And then I got through that and I continued to work with Chloe, and around the same time I started writing my experiences and building a website called This Is Hard to Say. And that's really what this project is about. It's about those stories, eating disorders. I mean, I would say the main drive for this is disordered eating, raising awareness. I found that people have a very limited understanding of disordered eating. Having that limited understanding promotes issues. It promotes having disordered eating. Diet culture perpetuates it here in America, especially. And obviously, we're not the only country struggling with this. And I know that just working with Chloe, like, she had more clients in other areas than in the United States. So it's a worldwide problem. And I just have such a desire to bring more awareness around it, to teach people it's the nuances, it's the gray areas, it's small ways, it's thinking you can't eat without exercising, it's thinking you have to push your body and exercise every day. Like, there's exercise is a part of it. There's body image. When I was going through recovery, I learned that body image is separate than an eating disorder, because an eating disorder doesn't really stem from how you think you look. That just ties into it somewhere along the road. It's a pretty big topic to unpack, but my eating disorder stems from trauma. And so This Is Hard to Say also holds those stories, but it also holds the joy and my creative life, because I am a graphic designer full-time and an artist. And so I also want to share those joys and those wins and those projects and the good things as well. That's what this project's about. And before I wrap this episode up, I wanted to just read a couple eating disorder statistics. I also have these up on my website. So it's thisishardtosay.me. And I'm just going to read through these. Some of these are pretty shocking. One of the ones that really gets me is that one person dies of an eating disorder every, I think it's 52 minutes. It's a incredibly serious mental illness. It's taken very seriously, and it's a lot of, the rate of people with an eating disorder who consider suicide is incredibly high. So with that said, I'll read these statistics. 9% of the US population, or 28.8 million Americans, will have an eating disorder in their lifetime. Less than 6% of people with eating disorders are medically diagnosed as underweight. It's a pretty low number. And eating disorders are not about weight. Let's just get that clear right now. Eating disorders are among the deadliest mental illness, second to opioid overdose. 10,200 deaths each year are the direct result of an eating disorder. That's one death every 52 minutes. It's pretty heavy. About 26% of people with eating disorders attempt suicide. BIPOC are significantly less likely than white people to have been asked by a doctor about eating disorder symptoms, which, by the way, in my lifetime, I've never in my life had a doctor ask me, and I've for sure been underweight. So if they're not asking me, they're definitely not asking other people. BIPOC with eating disorders are half as likely to be diagnosed or to receive treatment. Gay men are 7 times more likely to report binge eating and 12 times more likely to report purging than heterosexual men. Rates of body dissatisfaction were higher among transgender and non-binary youth, which is 90%, compared to cisgender youth at 80%. ADHD is the most commonly missed diagnosis in relation to disordered eating, which makes me think about nutrition. Larger body size is both a risk factor for developing an eating disorder and a common outcome for people who struggle with bulimia and binge eating disorder. Athletes report higher rates of excessive exercise than non-athletes. Athletes are more likely to screen positive for an eating disorder than non-athletes, but percentage across all probable eating disorder diagnoses are similar. Body dysmorphic disorder affects 1 to 3% of the overall population, but 13% of male military members and 21.7% of female military members. 35 to 57% of adolescent girls engage in crash dieting, fasting, self-induced vomiting, diet pills, or laxatives. In a college campus survey, 91% of the women admitted to controlling their weight through dieting. The most common type of eating disorders among military members is bulimia nervosa. Eating disorders affect at least 9% of the population. And I think that wraps it up. What I have posted on my website. I'll be adding to those statistics. Again, as I said, we're undereducated on this topic, and that includes people researching it. I mean, we're all learning more about how we function as humans, and I hope one day that they dial in the DSM and actually look at this as a bigger scale and a bigger range of, it's not just anorexia or bulimia. We have orthorexia as well, which is obsessing over health. It's obsessing over, like, I don't know, this is a bad example, but like rice cakes and nuts and, I'm gluten-free, or all these things, like being really specific, eating a ton of veggies and not protein or carbs or fat. And there's so much to talk about when it comes to this. But on my website, I also have a page for resources, which include my eating disorder coach. She goes by Flow with Chloe. I highly recommend her. If you need help, don't wait, get help. I also have another doctor on here that I really like, Dr. Colleen Reichman. She is a therapist. She has a history of eating disorders, and she is accessible on social media. Both of those people actually have a lot of resources to give and to help. If you want to support this project, I have a button on my website that says support this project. You can tip me, buy me a coffee. Thank you for joining me today. This is hard to say. Thank you for being here. You can find me on Instagram and the web. Instagram is @thisishardtosay with a period between each word. The website is www.thisishardtosay.me. My more personal and graphic design account is @ChelseaWillett_designs. Those will also be in the show notes below. If you want to support this project and podcast, there's a few ways to do so. You can head to my website, click the support button in the top right of the navigation, and that will lead you to how to help. You can also submit your own story anonymously, or you can share who you are. If this podcast spoke to you, it would be so appreciated to subscribe, leave a review, click some stars, and share it with your people. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.